Um, yeah, Charlie had asked me to speak for several minutes, and then perhaps we could have some discussion, open discussion. You know, I always feel, and I was asked to explain how I got into this business, the way I'm into it now. And I'm always embarrassed by, for example, this morning, getting the extensive applause, is because the truth is, I got dragged into this. It wasn't that I had any intention of getting into a public position. In fact, after I had testified, you know, and I'd written a paper in 1981, which was published in Science, and it was reported on the front page of New York Times by the science writer Walter Sullivan. So I got a lot of attention, and that got requests for me to testify to Congress. And I tried a few times, and then in 1988, when I realized I had some interesting results I thought that were worth reporting, I asked Rafe Pomerantz to make sure that when I testified there was some media there, and I found it got a lot more attention than I actually anticipated based on our prior attempts. But that actually convinced me that I didn't want to remain in that role of being in the public eye, because I'm not a public speaker, and I prefer to do science. And I only decided to testify one more time because of the fact that I had not made very clear. There was misinterpretation of what I said in 1988. Namely, it made it sound like, well, we're going to have droughts, because global warming is going to cause droughts. Well, it is true, but that higher temperatures will lead to more extreme droughts at the times and places when it is dry. But the other end of the hydrologic cycle also gets jacked up by global warming, because the air holds more water vapor, so you get heavier rains, you get more floods, and that's at least equally important. So I wanted to testify once more, and then I decided I'm going to get out of this public stuff, and I instead decided I would refer my request from the media, especially television, to Steve Snyder, who's very articulate and very good, and Michael Oppenheimer, who's also very articulate and capable. So for 15 years I did that until, and you know, I like to show this photo of Sophie, our first grandchild, which was taken in year 2000. She was 2 years old then, almost 2 years old. But I showed that only when I gave a scientific talk at Lamont Geophysical Observatory, where the day before I had been called in the newspaper the grandfather of global warming. And of course I knew that's not true. The people have been talking about greenhouse effect for 100 years. And but I wanted to show it was half true, that at least I was a grandfather. So it was just a joke. And then finally, and then in 2004, by the time, you know, had been asked to speak to Vice President Cheney and six cabinet members a couple of times, and I realized that Bush administration wasn't going to do anything about this subject, and so I decided I would like to give one public, and I was invited by I forget his name now. He had been the climate negotiator during the Clinton-Gore administration, and he asked me to give a talk at a Democratic fundraiser, and they were going to give me some award. But I said I didn't want to do that because I'm not a Democrat, and I'm independent, and I prefer not to get tied to either political party. But I said that I wanted to, but by that time I realized this gap between what was clear scientifically and what was understood, what was known by the public. And so I wanted to give one talk and back that up with some scientific papers to try, thinking naively that I could make that story clear and reduce this gap. Well, of course, but then the organization, so he told me that he would arrange for press coverage in Washington for a big talk, and then, so I worked like a dog for 6 months preparing for this talk and preparing the scientific papers to go with it on the planet's energy imbalance and a couple of other papers. And then I found that this organization chickened out and wouldn't, because they were afraid that Bush was going to win the election and they would get, they would suffer if they supported this. So I ended up giving the talk at the University of Iowa. I called my professor, Ben Allen, old professor, and asked him to arrange a public lecture. So I gave a talk in Iowa, but of course it didn't have much impact. But in that case, I had the next photo of Sophie and Connor, the one I showed today, where they're holding up, trying to explain the greenhouse effect with these little light bulbs. But that's too, I was not thinking of, you know, the moral issue, the fact that this intergenerational issue, which still did not really hit me, then finally, you know, in 2005, the end of 2005, when the Bush administration tried to prevent me from speaking to the media without going through a young fellow who would actually cut off any of the requests from the media. But so I decided at that time to make that public, to try to stop this censorship. And when 60 Minutes wanted me to talk about this on 60 Minutes, I decided, as I was walking down Broadway thinking about what, you know, how, if I was going to really make this clear, that's when I thought about my grandchildren. I decided I didn't want them to say, by that time I had 2 grandchildren, and I didn't want them to say, Opa understood what was happening, but he never made it clear, because there's no doubt that by the time my children are big, this climate issue will be clear. So that's still, but it's only the moral issue didn't really become clear to me until you know, I was asked to give a talk in the United Kingdom in about 2007 to try to get businessmen there to understand this global warming issue. And we decided, by that time realized that coal was really the big issue. So I made that point, and we decided at that time that they would try to influence the British decision to make a new big coal-fired power plant and try to stop that. And so we write a letter, and together they wrote a letter, but I wasn't entirely happy with that letter, so I decided to write a letter myself to the Prime Minister because he was Tony Blair, who said all the right words about this issue. And it is clear that the United Kingdom could get along without that coal-fired power plant. And if they won't take the first step, because they're more responsible on a per capita basis for the excess CO2 in the atmosphere than any other country in the world. The United States being second and Germany third on a per capita basis. But so I thought I made that story clear, but instead United Kingdom and Tony Blair had an inroads to George Bush, so he could have, you know, begun to put some pressure on the U.S. But what I found was, you know, they still wouldn't stop that. And in fact, then when young people, relatively young people, actually they were Greenpeace activists, but fairly young compared to me, blocked this one operation of King's North, then the government, you know, is going to try them, and with prison sentences being a possible punishment as well as a big fine. So I testified on their behalf. And now next week I'm going back again because the British government wouldn't accept the verdict of the public. There was a trial by jury, 12 people, 9 women and 3 men, who found these people innocent on the grounds that they were protecting property of greater value. Well, you would think that this would be a message to the British government. Instead, they're refusing to accept that agreement, that verdict, and they're taking it to higher court. I had several experiences with about 7 different nations where I thought, well, the Chancellor of Germany is a physicist. She will understand this if I write this very clearly with the graphs and things. So I wrote a letter to the Chancellor of Germany, and it was then translated into German, and was going to be published in a major newspaper. And the science advisor to the Chancellor convinced me that that was not the right tactic to hit her in the public that way, that instead I should come over and talk to them. Well, it turned out that I got outfoxed on that, because what really happened then, the newspaper, they delayed the meeting, it delayed and took up 6 weeks before it actually happened, and by that time it was old news, and the newspaper no longer wanted to publish that. So, but just one more country. The last one was actually Norway, which, if you think they're the greenest country on the planet, and they, in many ways, they are, but in fact, their Statoil is owned by the government, 70% by the government, and yet they're the company that's developing the tar sands in Canada. Very locally environmentally destructive. They would never allow that sort of thing in Norway, but they're developing it in. So what I learned was that all these governments, it's greenwash. They're saying the right words, but they're not taking actions. And if you just make the graph, the emissions just keep going up. And so that was one thing I learned. And then I was asked to give a talk at Virginia Tech, which I gave a couple of years ago. And the students there, who picked me up from the airport, told me about Cold River Mountain and the mountaintop removal there, and the fact that it didn't make sense, because if you cut off the top of this mountain, lowering the top 400 feet, the mountain is no longer viable as a for wind energy. And they, made calculations to show that in 100 years you could get as much energy from the wind as you would get from the cold that they were getting while they destroyed the mountain. So I got my arm twisted. I decided I would go to a protest, try to help draw attention to that mountaintop removal issue. And the people there, the people who are the heroes, are the ones like Larry Gibson, who refuses to sell his property on Kayford Mountain, which is a neighboring mountain. And the Massey Energy cannot blow up that mountain as long as he's there. And there's a graveyard with all of his relatives, so they're not able to take over this mountain. Though Gibson has ended up with bullet holes in the side of his cabin from drive-by shootings. Oh. But probably from miners who the rich people, the owner the top guy, the CEO, gets $27 million last year plus an $18 million deferred payment. So their miners aren't getting that much, but they managed to get them thinking that people like Larry Gibson are their enemy. So what, basically what's happened, Charlie suggested I comment about this fact that a lot of people are telling me I should be sticking to science and not sticking my nose into aspects of this problem which I may not be an expert on. But what I learned is that if you don't connect, it seems to me that scientists can connect the dots as well as anybody. And if we don't connect the dots all the way from the science to the implications for the policy that's needed to deal with the matter, then who's going to do that? It turns out that who does it, who wants to connect those last couple dots, is the politicians. But look at the results. All they have to do, I make this graph, and show, well, your policy's not working at all. The emissions are actually continuing to increase. So that's kind of how I got dragged into it. And it all the way to pricing carbon. I mean, it seems to me that you have to look at the basic things. As I say, it's as certain as the law of gravity. As long as fossil fuels are the cheapest energy, we will keep burning them. And you can't use tricks to fix that problem. That's why when they say they're going to put a cap on things, and this is not going to really be a tax, and it's not going to have a big effect on your electric bill or anything. They're pulling your leg. In my book I say that the politicians are lying to us. That's a strong statement. You could say they're kidding themselves. Maybe they really believe what they're saying. But that's why somebody needs to look at the rationale for connecting the dots all the way, because in fact, that's not going to work. If you don't actually increase the price enough to make it more precious and make you conserve it and make you shift to different forms of energy, then it's not going to solve the problem. Science is basically what science is your best attempt to, in a simple way, describe what you see in nature. So you use empirical evidence. You look at what's actually happening, and that's what I was doing, is making graphs of what is actually happening, and it's something that's just not done. And I'm sorry to say, environmentalists don't do this very well. And for example, let me get just 1 minute on a kick that I think is particularly important, and that is the fact that environmentalists think wind and sun is going to solve our energy needs. And Amory Lovins has done a great job of making clear how important energy efficiency is, but he also leaves the impression that all you need is these soft energies, that you don't need coal, oil, gas, you don't need large hydropower, you don't need nuclear power, and you don't even need a carbon tax. And so I make graphs of what he said in the 1970s and how his curve was going to go up and these soft energies would take over, but in fact they're still invisible on the graph. We have to look empirically at what's actually happening. And basically that's all that I'm trying to do. And then of course the last couple of years, because of the recognition of this greenwash, that's also caused me to think about what the implication of that is for my grandchildren. And finally, the last 2 years, I've started sinking into my head that this is really a moral issue. It's an issue of intergenerational injustice. young people, the young people here, and my grandchildren are all getting the short end of the stick. And we have to draw attention to that and make the public understand that, because the public does not understand that. If they did, we could get the policies that we need. But this communication problem is exceedingly difficult, and I'm completely incompetent to help with that. That's why I'm so glad to see so many young people, because when I see how well Bill McKibben's young people can get information out to the world, we need to get that sort of, we need to get young people who really stand up for their rights and communicate with the public, because we're running out of time. Thanks.